They were Hollywood's brightest stars, icons whose faces lit up the silver screen and whose names echoed through generations. But behind the fame and fortune lay secrets too dark to share, too scandalous to expose. Family secrets that didn't just threaten careers, they shattered legacies. Hidden children, forbidden affairs, betrayal, mental illness, and tragedies kept out of the public eye for decades. In this episode of Stage Whisper, we uncover 12 shocking family secrets buried beneath Hollywood's golden facade. The stories they never wanted you to know. Ingrid Bergman, The Exile of a Goddess. Ingrid Bergman was the epitome of cinematic elegance, a luminous presence in Casablanca, Gaslight, and Notorious. Her beauty was otherworldly, her talent undeniable. But in 1950, the very nation that once idolized her turned its back on her completely. Not for anything she did on screen, but for a deeply personal secret that exploded into an international scandal. At the time, Bergman was married to Swedish neurosurgeon Petter Lindström and had a daughter. But while filming Stromboli in Italy with director Roberto Rossellini, she began a passionate affair with him. Soon, she became pregnant with Rossellini's child, while still legally married. When the news reached the United States, it wasn't just the tabloids that had a field day. Politicians, religious groups, and the public condemned her harshly. The U.S. Senate even denounced her on record. Senator Edwin C. Johnson famously labeled her a powerful influence for evil, turning what should have been a private matter into a public trial of morality. She was essentially blacklisted from Hollywood, forced into exile in Europe, and separated from her daughter for years. But the deepest pain wasn't the media backlash. It was the quiet devastation within her family. Her first daughter, Pia, felt abandoned and later described their strained relationship as one haunted by distance and guilt. Bergman had 2 more children with Rossellini, but the damage to her first family was irreparable. Ingrid Bergman eventually returned to Hollywood years later and won an Oscar for Anastasia. But no award could erase the emotional wreckage of a family torn apart by scandal and a mother who paid the ultimate price for following her heart. 2. Angela Lansbury. Her daughter was nearly lost to Charles Manson. Angela Lansbury, the beloved star of Murder, She Wrote and countless stage triumphs, was long regarded as one of Hollywood's most elegant and composed figures. But behind her calm demeanor was a terrifying family secret that nearly cost her everything. A secret that involved drugs, cults, and a name that still haunts America, Charles Manson. In the 1960s, Lansbury's teenage daughter, Deirdre, fell into the wrong crowd in Los Angeles. Amid the turbulence of the era, she became entangled with a group of hippie drifters, one of whom was the soon-to-be cult leader, Charles Manson. At the time, Manson was just another charismatic figure hovering on the fringes of the LA scene, but his influence was already growing dangerous. He was recruiting vulnerable young people into what would become the infamous Manson family, a group responsible for one of the most horrifying murder sprees in American history. Lansbury later admitted in interviews that she noticed her daughter changing, slipping into drug use and disappearing for hours. When she discovered Deirdre had become close with Manson's inner circle, she didn't wait. With a mother's instinct and unshakable will, she pulled her entire family out of California overnight and moved them to Ireland, far from Manson's reach. It was a drastic decision, but it may have saved her daughter's life. Lansbury enrolled Deirdre in a new school, surrounded her with family, and slowly helped her rebuild her life. Few knew at the time that behind the poised, award-winning actress was a woman grappling with the terrifying possibility of losing her child, to drugs, to a cult, or worse. Angela Lansbury rarely spoke about the ordeal publicly, but in those few candid moments, she made one thing heartbreakingly clear. Stardom means nothing if you can't protect your own child from the darkness of the world you live in. 3. Marlene Dietrich, a mother-daughter relationship shrouded in silence. Marlene Dietrich was a goddess of the screen, sultry, androgynous, and unapologetically bold. With her sharp cheekbones and husky voice, she captivated audiences from The Blue Angel to Shanghai Express. But while the world marveled at her daring image, few knew the complexities of the relationship she had with her only child, Maria Riva. A relationship built not on affection, but on control, resentment, and decades of silence. To the public, Dietrich was fiercely independent and politically engaged. She rejected Nazi Germany, supported the troops in World War II, and challenged gender norms with her signature pantsuits. But behind closed doors, she was said to be obsessively image conscious and emotionally distant. Maria later revealed in her memoir that life with Marlene wasn't glamorous. It was emotionally draining and filled with manipulation. Dietrich demanded absolute loyalty, and that included her daughter. Maria was often treated as a prop in her mother's grand narrative, required to reflect perfection, but offered little warmth in return. The house was governed by her mother's strict rules, and any deviation from the ideal brought icy disapproval. Dietrich's romantic affairs, including rumored liaisons with both men and women, were concealed from Maria, but the emotional fallout was always palpable. Even as Maria grew older and pursued her own career, the shadow of her mother loomed large. Dietrich would call Maria dozens of times a day, often criticizing her appearance, choices, or emotions. It was psychological control dressed as maternal concern. Only after Dietrich's death did Maria finally speak freely, describing a childhood where love was conditional and silence was survival. The revelation stunned those who thought of Dietrich as untouchable. Here was a woman who fought fascism and broke boundaries, but couldn't offer her daughter a safe emotional space. The scandal wasn't in the public fights or arrests. It was in the slow erosion of trust between mother and child, a secret that was hidden in plain sight for decades. 4. Peter Lawford, the Kennedy connection, and the tragedy he couldn't escape. Peter Lawford was more than just a charming English actor in films like Ocean's 11 and The White Cliff of Dover. He was a member of the legendary Rat Pack, a fixture at glamorous parties, and, most infamously, a brother-in-law to President John F. Kennedy. But what should have been a golden connection to American royalty became a trap laced with secrets, guilt, and disgrace. The family he married into would ultimately play a role in his undoing. Lawford married Patricia Kennedy, sister of JFK, in 1954. On the surface, it was a perfect union. Hollywood meets Washington. But behind closed doors, Lawford was drawn into the intense secrecy of the Kennedy dynasty, a world where affairs were covered up, reputations were protected at all costs, and loyalty was demanded without question. The most damning secret of all came in 1962, when Lawford found himself at the center of one of Hollywood's most chilling mysteries, the death of Marilyn Monroe. Lawford had been instrumental in introducing Monroe to both John and Robert Kennedy, with whom she was rumored to have had affairs. On the night of her death, Lawford reportedly spoke to Monroe multiple times. Some accounts suggest he knew she was in danger, or at least deeply unwell, but failed to act. To this day, conspiracy theories swirl around Marilyn's death, and Lawford's name is never far from them. His silence, whether out of fear, guilt, or instruction, remains a haunting question mark. As the years passed, the glamorous image of Peter Lawford began to crack. His marriage to Patricia fell apart. He descended into drug and alcohol abuse. By the time of his death in 1984, he was estranged from the Kennedy clan, broke and alone. The secret wasn't just what Lawford knew. It was what he could never say. Tied to the most powerful family in America, he became both a witness and a casualty to their darkest chapters. 5. Barbara Stanwyck, the secret of the child she left behind. Barbara Stanwyck was the queen of the strong, sharp-tongued woman on screen. From Double Indemnity to Stella Dallas, she ruled with fierce independence and emotional depth that few could rival. But for all her commanding presence and control, there was one secret that followed her until her final days. The child she tried to raise, and then quietly let go. Before Stanwyck became a Hollywood powerhouse, she and her husband, actor Frank Fay, adopted an infant boy in 1932. To the public, this was the perfect image of a family, young, successful, generous. But behind the studio-engineered illusion, cracks formed quickly. Fay was allegedly abusive and alcoholic, and Stanwyck's own maternal instincts were complicated. She was known for her discipline and perfectionism, traits that clashed with the demands of motherhood. As her career soared, she grew more distant from her son, Dion. Eventually, she sent him away to boarding school and rarely saw him afterward. In adulthood, Dion tried to reconnect with her, but Stanwyck kept him at arm's length. She never publicly acknowledged the estrangement. Dion later gave interviews describing their icy relationship and claiming that he was essentially disowned. While Stanwyck was celebrated for her strength and resilience, the human cost of that ambition was buried deep in her private life. The ultimate irony? She was nominated for an Oscar for playing a self-sacrificing mother in Stella Dallas, a role that brought audiences to tears. But in real life, the woman who could move millions on screen couldn't find the will to keep her own son close. It wasn't a tabloid scandal. It was something quieter, sadder, and perhaps more painful. A mother who walked away and never looked back. 6. Rita Hayworth, the forgotten abuse behind the screen. Siren Rita Hayworth was the ultimate 1940s pinup, voluptuous, exotic, and impossibly glamorous. Her role in Gilda made her an icon of seduction, and for a time, she was the fantasy of an entire generation. But while millions of soldiers taped her photo to their lockers, few knew the devastating truth that haunted her past. A family secret so dark that Hayworth never fully escaped it: her own father. Born Margarita Carmen Cancino, Rita was thrust into show business from a young age by her father, Eduardo Cancino, a Spanish-born dancer. He pushed her into performing with him in nightclubs while she was still a teenager. But behind the polished dance routines was something far more disturbing. Hayworth never publicly confirmed the extent of the abuse, but close friends and biographers have long suggested that her father had an unhealthy, possibly incestuous obsession with her. He was controlling, possessive, and lived with her even into her early fame. Some even claimed that he referred to Rita not just as his daughter, but his companion. The lines between protection and exploitation were deeply blurred. The trauma shaped her life. Rita struggled with intimacy and trust. She married 5 times, including to Orson Welles and Prince Ali Khan, but none of her relationships lasted. Her daughter, Yasmin, once stated that her mother had a deep sadness that could never be soothed. It's no wonder that Hayworth reportedly said, "Men fell in love with Gilda, but they woke up with me." Later in life, Hayworth suffered from early-onset Alzheimer's disease, a condition that robbed her of her memory, but perhaps, mercifully, blurred the pain of the past. Still, for those who knew her best, the shadow of her father's influence never lifted. Hollywood sold her as a goddess. But behind the lights and cameras was a wounded daughter, carrying a secret too terrible to speak aloud. 7. Lana Turner, a daughter, a knife, and a secret that shook Hollywood. Lana Turner was Hollywood royalty, sultry, elegant, and forever associated with scandalous glamour. But in 1958, the public's obsession with her took a dark and almost surreal turn. It wasn't one of her films that had people talking. It was a real-life murder. And at the heart of it all was her teenage daughter, a bloody knife, and a secret so twisted it shattered the image of a perfect Hollywood home. At the time, Turner was romantically involved with Johnny Stompanato, a former Marine turned bodyguard and known associate of notorious gangster Mickey Cohen. Their relationship was volatile and allegedly abusive. Friends and colleagues recalled bruises, screaming matches, and Stompanato's growing possessiveness. He controlled Turner's movements, harassed her on film sets, and even threatened co-stars like Sean Connery with violence. On April 4, 1958, things reached a breaking point. Turner's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane, overheard yet another explosive argument between her mother and Stompanato. Fearing for her mother's life, Cheryl grabbed a kitchen knife and confronted him in the bedroom. In the chaos, she stabbed Stompanato once, directly in the chest, killing him almost instantly. The story made front-page headlines across America. A murder in the home of one of Hollywood's most famous actresses? A teenager committing the act? The nation was gripped. But what followed was even more unsettling. The inquest ruled Cheryl's act justifiable homicide. She had acted in defense of her mother. But behind the legal verdict lay a tangled mess of emotional trauma, manipulation, and cover-up. Rumors swirled that Turner might have wielded the knife herself, or that the studio orchestrated the entire narrative to protect its star. Years later, Cheryl revealed in her memoirs that her childhood was filled with instability, fear, and conflicting loyalties. She never doubted that her mother loved her, but also admitted that she had spent her youth protecting a woman who was at times as reckless as the men she invited in. Lana Turner's career never fully recovered. Though she continued acting, the pristine image was shattered. And in the end, the most haunting role she ever played wasn't on film. It was the role of a mother caught in a real life tragedy that no screenwriter could have dreamed up.